Good morning once again, folks. How's the food coma going? Anybody? I made turkey carcass soup. Anybody at that stage yet? No? You don't do that? You just throw your turkey carcass away? Yeah? No? You don't use it? No dogs? All right. We're back at it, 2 Corinthians. We're at the 8th chapter. And today we will cover verses 16 to 24. So the second, the second half of 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And here, as we've been talking about for a few weeks, Paul is focusing on the matter of finances. There was a particular need with the Judean church, the church in Jerusalem. We don't know exactly why, mostly or probably because of persecution, but other factors also for sure were relevant. But regardless of why, Paul and other leaders of the church felt the need to help that hub of Christianity. That's where it all started, right? So a very important place. So in this particular voyage of Paul's, he would stop by a few churches, express, how there was a need, and collect certain funds so that he could eventually make his way all the way back to Jerusalem and help those brethren out. And he had mentioned, these things before to these other churches so that they would be prepared to give whenever him or one of his associates would stop by. So here, specifically within this section, these couple of chapters that we've been covering and will continue to cover, Paul is addressing this issue. And now he gets to a point where Paul in general was very good at this, but here in particular we see it very obvious that he is someone who is very frontward thinking. In other words, he perceives things that could be an issue, that could be a problem, and he tries to deal with those issues before they happen. In other words, he was very proactive. Instead of being reactive. Now, there are certain things in life where there is no way for you to know, and you have to react. But other things in life, as you would agree, I'm sure, you can be proactive, because you can potentially foresee things and issues that will arise. And here, he is explaining certain tactics of his, how he organized certain things due to the fact that he was being proactive with regards to the money collection process. So we'll see exactly how this works out. So let me go ahead and read throughout, and you can follow along, and then we go back and take it one portion at a time as we usually do. So again, starting on verse 16, and it says, "But thanks be to God who puts the same earnest care for you into the heart of Titus. For he not only accepted the exhortation, but being more diligent, he went to you of his own accord, and we have sent him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches, and not only that, but who was also chosen by the churches to travel with us with the gifts, which is administered by us to the glory of the Lord himself, and to show your ready mind. Avoiding this, that anyone should blame us in this lavish gift, which is administered by us, providing honorable things not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of man. And we have sent with them our brother, whom we have often proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent because of the great confidence which we have in you. If anyone inquires about Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker concerning you. Or if our brethren are inquired about, they are messengers of the churches the glory of Christ. Therefore, show to them and before the churches the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf. So once again, Paul continues to deliberate and talk about this very important topic of finances. Specifically speaking, he was collecting funds to help this particular region, these Christians in Judea. And very likely Titus was the one that was bringing this letter. But he was not coming on his own. Here, Paul is actually listing 3 people, including Titus, that would go to Corinth for the purpose of collecting these funds. Now, why is this important? Paul needed to build a sense of trust and credibility. Now, with anything that is important, but once again, I think all of us would agree that when we discuss, when we think about, when we do things that are financial, then there's an extra level of scrutiny. People are always thinking about issues that could arise or things that one might be doing with said money or said funds. So Paul understood this. Paul understood that this was a very touchy, even borderline taboo, sensitive topic. And he wanted, as I mentioned initially, to be proactive. He needed to build trust. He needed to build credibility. And he did so by making sure that certain people were involved in this collection process. And here he's going to name them, one of them at least, but he is going to sort of give them their resume, why they were chosen for that particular position or to do what they were doing. So he starts off by saying, initially here on verse 16, once again, but thanks be to God who puts the same earnest care for you into the heart of Titus. So here he is reintroducing Titus. Titus was someone that the church was familiar with, and in general, he was one of Paul's main disciples, so he was well known in that regard. And here he was the deliverer of this particular letter, very likely. And Paul was again introducing once again, but with the focus of Titus being this person who would collect these funds. And he starts off by basically just saying that Titus had the same earnest love or care for the church that Paul had. If you remember, Paul had spent quite a bit of time sort of defending his feelings, his love, his passion, his compassion, his desire for the church in Corinth. He was literally defending his intentions. And now he's saying basically the same thing can apply to Titus. He cares for you just as much as I do. And he continues on 17 by saying, for he not only accepted the exhortation, but being more diligent, he went to you of his own accord. So something here must have caught Paul even by surprise. Obviously, Paul was a person of authority, and Titus, even though they were co-workers, technically Titus was under Paul, if you will. He was his disciple. Paul was his mentor, his father in Christ. And Paul could have just told him what to do. And I'm sure in many occasions, Paul had to tell Titus what to do. He was not shy about that. But in this particular situation, Paul was even seemingly caught off guard, positively alarmed. He's saying here, I was kind of going to tell him, but I really didn't need to truly tell him because he wanted to do it. Now think about this for a second. We know all about this church. We know all about the accusations and the issues that the church had. And now put in this extra layer of this the collection of funds. I think many people would run away from this responsibility. I know I would. I would not raise my hand. The only way that I would do what Titus would be doing was that if there was like, a bunch of people in line and everyone stepped back and I was the only one left to do this particular task. But I would have never raised my hand, much less been so eager to do this type of job. Yet, Titus had the heart for this church and the heart for the church in Jerusalem, and was rather brave. To the point where, again, Paul did not need to exhort him. Paul did not need to force him. He was doing this out of his own accord, and he was being very much diligent. So here again, Paul is giving a little bit of Titus's resume. He's going to talk later on about the fact, again, that he was his fellow co-worker and his partner. Titus was well known, so he didn't need to talk too much about Titus. So then he goes on, because Titus was not by himself. On verse 18, from 18 to 19, actually, he states here, "And we have sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. And not only that, but who was also chosen by the churches to travel with us with this gift, which is administered by us to the glory of the Lord himself, and to show your ready minds." So now we have a second person. But now we have somewhat of an issue as well, because this person is unnamed. Now, we don't know why Paul never mentioned this person by name. There are theories out there, there's speculation, but ultimately we will never know. But he gives us enough insight to know the pedigree of this person. We know that this person was known throughout the churches in Asia Minor. Not only that, his reputation was such that they chose him for this particular job. He must have been very honorable, very honest. Again, he had credibility. People trusted him. He was well regarded. Paul mentioned that he was a messenger of the churches towards the end, which is, by the way, the same word as apostle. So maybe he was even a high-ranking official of a particular church. He was not a member of the church of Corinth, obviously, because here he's kind of introducing this person. We don't know for sure if they knew this person very well, but they very likely knew of his reputation. And even if they didn't know, now they had something to base their trust off of. Again, Paul wasn't even the one that chose this person. He states here that the churches were the ones that selected this individual to go along in this very important task. In other words, Paul allowed the churches to have this level of agency, knowing fully well that it was beneficial for this money collecting process if other people were involved. Paul knew about his own character. Paul understood his intentions, but also Paul was no dummy. He had been accused of many horrible things in the past, and frankly, he didn't need to be accused of this. So he established an environment. Again, he was being very proactive to the point where he was including other people in the decision-making process and allowing them to make these types of decisions so that the process would go smoothly. And then he continues. We're actually going to skip verse 21 to 20 to 21. We'll go back to it. But on verse 22, he introduces another person. It says here on verse 22, "And we have sent with them our brother, whom we have often proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent because of the great confidence which we have in you." So here is the third person, a second brethren, in addition to Titus. And once again, the question remains, what was his name? I have no idea. Paul knew who he was. This person in particular seems to be someone closer to Paul than that second person who the other churches selected. So here, this third person seems to be a person that Paul himself selected, but he chose not to give a name. Why? We don't know. Paul is getting up there in age, and I'm sure we are in a smaller church, so it's not much of an issue, but I'm sure you've attended a bigger church, and you've had people call you sister, brother, and it seems very spiritual, right? Seems, family-oriented. Baloney, they just don't know your name. They don't know your, hey, you. Seems kind of cute. They forgot your name. You told them once, maybe twice. But again, a bigger environment, and, they forgot your name. And from now on, you are sister, and you are brother for the end of time. I go through that, very often. Hardly ever do I remember a name the first time out. Sometimes it gets a little awkward. For example, if you meet like a new neighbor. Like I know Mike and Ken, but it took a while, probably because they came to church and then we, interact almost on a weekly basis. But some of my neighbors, again, we get introduced and then we exchange pleasantries and names or whatever. But it's not like you interact with them very often, so I tend to forget. And then inevitably, you kind of bump into them again, and then there's that awkward moment where you don't think you should ask for their name again, but you should because you don't remember it. But now if you don't, it's going to be like that forever unless you go and steal their mail. And then you can figure out, or, you do some hardcore Googling and figure out, all of their, personal information. Long story short, closing parentheses, Paul knew their name. And people knew of these people. The reason why he didn't mention them by name, we don't know for sure, but Paul is giving enough insight for them to understand and be in a position that they would accept these people and that they were in fact trustworthy. He closes off this section by motivating this idea of dual responsibility or mutual responsibility. Because up until this point, Paul is kind of doing all the work. He is the one organizing, orchestrating this collection process. He is the one being proactive, making sure that people don't think he's up to funny business. He's opening up to other people to be included in this process of deciding who is going to take money to whom and when and how. But the other parties also had responsibility. In other words, the churches had responsibility, including the church in Corinth. And here he's going to elaborate and list some of these responsibilities. What were their responsibilities? Verse 23. If anyone inquires about Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker concerning you. Or if our brethren are inquired about, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. Therefore, show to them and before the churches the proof of your love and our boasting on your behalf. So now Paul, he is making clear that it's not all his responsibility. And now the ball is in or on their court. Paul has, again, done everything that he could to make this process very clear, very transparent, very open. But the church had an obligation as well. What were their obligations? To receive, to accept these people. He even states here that they needed to prove their love. It's one thing for you to say you love. It's one thing for you to utter the words. But here Paul was giving them an opportunity to actually practice that which they professed or they preached. Not only that, but Paul also thought that this was a good opportunity for them to validate all the boasting. We've covered a bunch of the bad stuff, but there are a lot of good stuff as well that Paul himself boasted about. Even these brothers that he mentioned here, one of them, I think the last one, he kind of established that he was kind of excited about going because he heard of all the great things that Paul bragged to him about them. So Paul basically is saying here, look, I've bragged about you. I've boasted about you. I've told people, about not only bad things, but actually a lot of good things. And now it is your opportunity to follow up and again to validate all of this boasting that I have been doing on your behalf. So again, there was mutual responsibility. It wasn't just about Paul. It wasn't just about Corinth. It wasn't just about the other churches. Everyone had to be on the same page. But now, as I mentioned, let's go back to those verses that I skipped, verse 20 to 21. And the reason why I left this to the end, because here Paul basically, he gives us the reasoning behind all of this. The mentality, his thought process. He says on verse 20, avoiding this, that anyone should blame us in this lavish gift which is administered by us, providing honorable things not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of man. Paul actually had alluded to this idea before, or actually chronologically, he would do it after. But this idea of having this clear conscience between man and God. He actually stated so in Acts chapter 24 when he was being tried and making his case before the governor Felix. And he was being accused of, a bunch of things, including, riling up people to riot against the government, so on and so forth. And then he starts to explain that none of those things were true, but then, again, he frames it with this thought. I strive, I'm diligent to make sure that I have a clear conscience, not only before God, but also before man. Now, out of all the people that you would expect to utter those words, I think Paul would be sort of in the least of that list. Because again, everything that we hear and discover about Paul in the Bible seems like he was a rather brave guy and was not scared of making enemies, was not scared of speaking his mind, was not scared of sticking up for the truth, God's truth, most importantly, even if everyone was against him. But again, he also is the type of person that recognized the value of having a clear conscience, not only before God, but also before man. Why? Because of the idea of credibility that we are seeing here. Again, all of this was orchestrated for the purpose of building trust, of building credibility. And we almost see somewhat of an equation here as to how Paul was trying to achieve this. And it's something that is transferable, something that can be applied individually here, communally as well, in all aspects of life. How do you build trust? How do you build credibility? Well, we see here very clearly that one of the variables in this equation is the idea of integrity. What is integrity? Basically, integrity is you doing the right thing. You have the right moral and ethical ideas about life, and you practice those ideals or ideas. Again, integrity is as valuable as anything when it comes to building trust and building a sense of credibility. If a person does not have integrity, then it's very hard for you to trust that person. But integrity is not the only variable in this equation. Why? Because the person can have all of the integrity in the world, but if the person never opens themselves up for scrutiny, for an evaluation, in other words, if they're not open to, people sifting through their mess, then that integrity becomes so secretive that people have room to question. So what needs to be added to that equation? We need integrity, but we also need accountability. And what is accountability? Essentially, it's the willingness to be answerable. People might say, well, I have integrity. I don't need anyone, again, sifting through my dark little secrets, because there are none out there. But without accountability, without the willingness to open oneself up to scrutiny, and if something comes up, you make adjustments. Without that, there is no trust, there is no credibility. So now we have our nice little equation. What do we need for credibility? Credibility or trust it's the end goal. It's the result. What plus what equals credibility? Integrity plus accountability. And you see how if you take one of them out, the whole equation falls apart? Can you build credibility with just integrity and no accountability? No, it's hard. You're always going to be thinking whether or not that person truly is who they're saying they are, even if they are, or doing what they're saying they're doing. Now, what about the other one? If you have accountability but no integrity, can you build trust? Can you build credibility? No. You're opening yourself up to scrutiny, but what people find is anything but, trustworthiness in you. They find every reason, actually, not to trust you. And again, it's at the heart of what Paul is speaking to here. Paul knew that ultimately he was accountable to God. But that doesn't mean that his relationships to others weren't important as well, or even a reflection of that relationship, that sincere heart, that clean sense of not knowing that he was not going to be judged by ill doing before God, but also he cared about what others knew about him, thought about him in a sense. He wasn't consumed by that. There's a difference, but it was as important as his relationship to God because it was an extension of that. How do we close up? How do we sort of summarize and digest this? As a church, obviously, finances are important. We run a pretty tight ship here, right? Because of those that came before us, we own our own building, and that's a blessing. Those who came before us were diligent, worked hard, were generous, to the point where we have this. None of us were here from the beginning. Some of you have been here, longer than others. But a lot of this was put together, was built, and paid for, even before we were here. So there is a debt of gratitude for those that came before us. And since we have been blessed with all of this, it makes sense for us to not only take advantage of that, but also take care of that. Which means having to deal with maintenance, having to deal with finances, having to deal with payroll, having to deal with bills. It is our responsibility. It is not one person's responsibility. There is a mutual responsibility. It is a collective approach to ministry. And our job is to be as transparent as possible in that process, so that there are no questions as to what is being paid, who is being paid, how is it being paid. So consider this your invitation to our year-end business meeting, which will happen in a couple of weeks. That's where we go through our budget. And it's kind of boring, it's kind of dull. Maybe some of you find it very exciting, I doubt it. But it's important. Why is it important? It's important because it is a collective effort. And by you partaking in that, not only in the giving, but also in the knowing, there's a sense of collaboration. There's a sense of ownership. There's a sense of not only doing, but also knowing. And knowing what everything and how everything is functioning and happening. Again, we're a rather small church, so it's not very difficult to, simple arithmetic. You add a couple of numbers, you take a few numbers away, and then we go through all the steps to figure out our budget for next year. But it is important for us to do so in a manner that is functional, but also brings glory to God. Because again, if everyone is involved in that process, then there's credibility. There's trust. There's no room for rumors or ideas that aren't, ideal for how a church should run, or anything else that the devil wants to instill upon our hearts to sort of break up community of believers. Again, Paul is very clear. He was extremely clear. His obligation and his responsibility was unto God, but also unto others. Amen.